Oh, she comes to our workshop as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and also Sean Hyatt, Davis, Jerry Davis, and Mark Mizruki do governance from more of a sociological perspective.
No, I don't
Maybe
know.
those names don't ring a bell.
Okay, so it's noon, so maybe we should start.
Okay.
Luo, please.
Thanks, Lotus. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, TJ Wang, a professor at USC. TJ is an expert on accounting and corporate governance in emerging markets. He has published numerous articles in top accounting and finance journals. He is currently the associate editor of Management Science and has served as an editor for the Accounting Review and in the editorial board of several top accounting journals. His research is frequently featured in media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal and The Economist. Prior to joining USC, TJ served as the dean of the Chinese University of Hong Kong Business School from 2008 to 2013. And TJ was a professor at HKUST when I was an undergraduate student there. I learned tremendously from TJ over these years as a student, as a friend. Without further ado, I will turn it over to TJ.
All right. Thank you, Luo, for inviting me and giving me the introduction. Let me share my screen first. Okay, so this is the slides I'm going to use. I don't need to finish all the slides and just ask me any questions you want. So the topic for today is relational contracts and social networks in China, challenges and solutions. I've been working on this topic for a long time. I started going to China in 1994 and trying to understand the governance and accounting issues there. And I realized that actually relationship-based transactions is really the way companies transact with one another. And that's very different from the contracts, these classical contracts I'm so used to, involving arm's length investors and stakeholders in the US. So it took me a while to really understand what's going on. So I hope I can share with you my thoughts and also some of the recent research I've done and some future work that we can do. And I hope that the work that I'm presenting will help you or give you a framework to understand a bit more about emerging firms in emerging markets. So stop me anytime, okay? All right, so outline of my talk. First is why pay attention to relational contracts and social networks and the reasons why they're so prevalent in emerging economy. And I want to use a institutional perspective. So understand really the underlying institutions, and I'll explain what those institutions are. And then I talk about with the relational contracts, what are the firm's governance response to the contracts? So what do the firms look like? And then I'll talk about social network playing a big role in this. And I talk about a couple of 3 or 4 papers that I've done related to that and some future research. And these papers will help us understand more about relational contracts and some solutions, because there's some challenges with relational contracts, as you will see, and then I'll talk about some solutions. Okay, why did I get interested in this? It started really in 1997, the Asian financial crisis, and there are many Asian economies that were really devastated by that, right? With Indonesia, Thailand, Korea, and so on. And a stream of research started from that, and I got very interested in it. I want to understand what's going on. And as you can see, Indonesia, right, the stock market got completely wiped out, like 91% drop. And then GDP also dropped more than 50%. And South Korea is not much better, right? 70% drop and so on. So a lot of, a big shock during that year or the couple of years around that. And a lot of the problems related to relational contracts or the relationship-based transactions, and also the governance are related to that. There's a book that has inspired me to think more deeply about this. It's done by, written by Raghu Rajan in Chicago, talking about a concept called fault lines. And it's these fault lines that create this Asian financial crisis and related to relational contracts. So I want to explain a little bit what's going on. Okay, so the idea is that there's a clash of 2 systems going on. One system relies a lot on relationship-based transactions, and the other system relies more on arm's length transactions. So people that don't know each other can engage in transactions because of law, because of accounting, because of all these institutional support. These are called formal institutions, right? Whereas in economies like the emerging economies with not a lot of these formal institutions, then they use informal ways to enforce their contracts and allow them to transact with one another. And they end up using a lot of relationships. These are called informal institutions that allow for transactions. And because these systems are so different, it creates a clash. And during the early mid-90s, a lot of money from the West was going to the East, going to East Asia and Southeast Asia because the two places are booming. But because they rely on relationship-based transactions, so the money that's going in are not following the same terms that we normally use in the West. So the Western capital providers, because they do not understand the relationship-based kind of transactions, will usually loan money to these countries for long-term projects, but just giving them short-term loans. And also the loans are denominated in US currency instead of their local currencies. So when Asia's financial crisis hit, two things happened. These countries want to pull the money out, and also they want to pull the money out. So the Asian countries are faced with two problems. One is they have a currency issues, right? They have to suddenly their local currency dropped in value, but they have to pay back US dollars. So they're exposed to huge currency risk. The other is a lot of the projects are long-term projects, but the loans short-term, and they pull these short-term loans. So they have a liquidity crisis. So I guess the lessons that we've learned is that because of this clash of the two systems, one is relationship-based, the other is arm's length, and the problems involved, right, because of the lack of transparency and understanding across the two systems, it can create a fault line for capital flowing from one region to another. And through that, I've been thinking about, why these emerging economies rely so much on relationship-based transactions or contracts. Will this problem persist? And what are the solutions? So these are questions I want to ask. Any questions? If not, I'll keep going. So the first thing I want to ask is why, engage in these relationship-based transactions? Why are they so prevalent in emerging economies, especially in East Asia and Southeast Asia? Right? And I have three sort of perspectives to help us understand that. And that's from, as I said, the institutional perspective, to understand the institutions, right? Underlying institutions that help us to understand this. The first is, it's because of the underdeveloped markets and legal systems. So it's the market and legal institutions that has explained this relational contracts. When a country has very developed markets and especially the legal system, when arm's length parties transact with one another in the marketplace, they feel comfortable doing so because they are protected by law. They're also protected by a very good accounting system, right? So that they know that if they engage in this transaction, they'll get the money back if they ship the product to the buyer. Right? But in a system where market is not well developed and the legal system is poor, then it's tough to do that. Right? You always worry. First of all, it's hard for you to find the right kind of buyer and seller. There's very little trust in the transaction, and you worry that the seller will buy will rip you off. So you rely on personal relationships to find the right kind of buyers and sellers, and you rely on personal relationships to enforce the contracts. So that's the typical sort of explanation for why there are so many relational contracts. But there are other two that I think are very important, especially when we want to understand China, but also applies to quite a lot of emerging economies. It's the social norms and political economy. And that's something that I want to spend more time on when I want to explain to you how we understand China and the relational contracts in China. So I'll focus on China. A lot of research that I've done involve these firms. So I'll go over, again, the legal institutions first. Company law started in the 16th century in England and helped and shaped the modern finance in that country and also in the West. Did not come to China until about 1904, about more than 100 years ago. So compared to England 400 years ago, it only come to China 100 years ago. Before that time, merchants in China sought property rights protection by relying on the government, by building relationship, the patron-client relationship with the government, having the politicians protect their property rights. So when they have business disputes, they don't go to courts because there's no company law to protect them. So what they do is go to the village leaders and using informal rules to sort of resolve the disputes. And business contracts are actually done within ancestral halls. They rely on their personal relationships to resolve conflicts. And these are all people in the same village, probably under the same last name. They're all relatives, so that they can go to an ancestral hall to resolve conflicts because they all believe that, or they all worship the same ancestor, right? This is the religion at that time, right? And to worship ancestors. So using religion as a way to help them enforce contracts. So it's an informal rule in the absence of law. Now, on top of that, the social norms in China are also strengthening this way of using relationship to enforce contracts. So Chinese prefer to associate with people that have permanent relationships, close ties with them. And there are lots of books about that. If you're interested in that, I recommend you to read a book called From the Soil by Fei Xiaotong, last name Fei. Has a very good theory to explain what's going on. Now, but one thing I want to emphasize about permanent relationship is that, I don't know if you experienced this, but for Chinese, I think Koreans do the same thing. For Chinese to go out, a bunch of Chinese friends to go out to dinner, sometimes you will see them fighting to pay the bill, right? In the US, we're so used to sharing the bill, but in China, people fight to pay it. The reason for that is, or one of the reasons is that you want to signal to your friends that there is a next time. The relationship is permanent, right? If I pay, it means that you're going to pay next time, right? So if we split the bill, it means that there may not be a next time. So having this concept or signaling that we value permanent relationships is very important. And we apply that actually to business as well. And because of that, we also see that business transactions often confined to geographic location because relationships and close ties can only be developed in a smaller geographic location, because at that time, people don't travel that much. And that's why it's called from the soil. People are tied to the soil because, 100 years ago, before Industrial Revolution in China, most people are engaging in farming and so on. So this can lead to, because of these permanent relationships, right? People just can only rely to work with your friends and families, and you engage in very long-term relationship. That means these contracts are very long-term. It will result in hold-up problems. And this kind of hold-up problems also force people to engage in relationships to make sure that the hold-up problem will not exist. So with these relational contracts, how do we resolve conflicts? How do we enforce contracts? We use informal rules and laws that help us to govern our relationship. So we use these informal laws to govern relationships to apply to contracts that we use in business that also rely on relationship. And because of that, everything is highly specific. Now, what I mean by that is, in the US, if you engage in a business transaction, typically we rely on some kind of formal law to protect us. And the law applies to everyone in the same way, right? So same law apply to all the contracting party, right? But if we rely on relational contracts and every relationship is unique, then it's really hard for a third party to understand how the law is being applied to the two parties that engage in the relationship contract. Because we really, as a third party, right, you really don't know how deep the relationship is or how permanent the relationship between the two people. And because of that, it's really hard to judge how the contract's being enforced. Now, if the relationship is very, very close, and if these two people know each other very well, like from the same family, they can be very flexible. They would, if something happened to the contract, they would allow the third party not, the counterparty not to pay, or even if the contract result in a loss, the contract will still go on for multiple years to help one another, because they view the contract as very long term. Now, if you don't know the relationship, you wouldn't know, right? You may assume that they don't know each other very well, and the contract would, because it ends in a loss, the contract will terminate in a year or so. Right? So the point is, to understand the contracts, you have to understand the relationship, and every relationship is unique. So it's really hard. If you're not in a network, it's even hard for you to evaluate the contracts. So another institution called political economies, right? And that's just understanding the relationship between government and firms. And in China, it's quite different from the West, as you may imagine. And I think recently we talk about trade war, a lot of the problems are involved with government involvement in the firms, and people question about that. And it's true, because of the political system, the government get involved in business transactions a lot, because they still control a lot of resources. The politicians control a lot of resources. China, the central government has decentralized the power to the provincial government. So the provincial leaders control a lot of resources, and they would give to the firms, but in a way that is a lot of times based on relationship as well, because the control rights or these assets are still controlled by the government and cannot be sold to the firms. And what they can do is they can pass the usable rights to the firm, right? So the way they pass the usable rights to the firm is not through formal contracts, but a lot of times through relationship. If you're closer to the government, you will be able to get more of those resources. And it applies to natural resources, public utilities, operating rights, even labor, financial capital, and so on, licensing, tax benefits, right? So firms have to build relationship with politicians in order to get those resources. And that explains why that is also another explanation why relationship is so important. These relational transactions are so important because of the government. And we cannot use standardized contract to understand the exchange. And the exchanges that need highly specific contracts that are based on relationships result in transactions that are not very standardized. And there's another concept in China called giving face, like giving face, and in Chinese called mianzi, giving face, right? Giving face is if you have a party and if you can invite someone very famous or have a lot of social capital in your community to attend your party, that person is giving you face, right? Why is giving face important? Now, in the business context, is the person is giving the assurance to the rest of the community that this person is a good person. And also the person that gives face usually would transfer some of the relationships, right, to the person that he or she is giving face to. Now, in politics, it's the same thing. If a politician is coming to help you and giving you face, it also means that the politician may be willing to transfer some of the assets that he or she controls to the person that he's giving face to use for business purposes. Right? Now, he or she cannot sell it to the person, but he can transfer some of the usable rights to that person. Right? So that's why relationship is very important, and it's related to the concept of giving face. Okay, so with these kind of ideas, you will then understand firms will work very hard to build relationships. But you say, oh, well, it's just only the firm that build relationships with the government. What about other firms, right? Is it that prevalent? Is it just a few firms that build relations with the government? That's it. But there's a spillover effect, right? The idea is that not only do you have to understand the firm that builds relations with the government, but that firm that has relations with the government, when that firm transacts with another firm, we have to understand this blue connection or this relationship as well. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So in the second bullet point, it says that firm A obtains resources from the government based on relationship. And then in the third bullet point, it says that in signing a contract with A, B has to know how secure A's relationship with the government in order to ensure that A has the resources. So that means it's not just about A and the government. When B transacts with A, B has to understand the relationship of A with the government. So this will have a ripple effect that if this resources that we're talking about is very big, then to understand the relationship between A and the government is very important, because it can have a ripple effect on how A transacts with other firms and how these transactions will affect other transactions. So understanding network relationships become very important because it affect a whole host of stakeholders, especially in that same geographic location, because local government has a lot of influence within that province. Okay, so let me, any questions? I'm okay, right? I just want to make sure that I haven't lost you. Okay, so
we have one question,
okay, sure.
TJ.
Yes.
Bahai Eliaf, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah.
Maybe their audio is off. They've written it in the text and they say, is this something long-term or are we expecting this to change? Will this change over time? I presume maybe as institutions develop, maybe there'll be less sort of the informal social networking, or with changes in political structure, they also say.
Excellent question, right? Especially with social media and so on, will that change? I say yes and no. Some will change. I think urbanization has helped the change because a lot of the people have left, the theory we talk about, these transactions based on social ties are probably happening a lot in small towns and villages. And when you go to huge urban area, you don't have that informal rules as much. However, we still see, I'm still doing research and seeing this type of relational contracts happening, or relationship based transaction happening in urban areas in China, or firms that are in urban areas. I think a lot of it is just mentioned. Institutions take time to change, and formal institutions take time to build, especially when government has such control over the economy and formal rules are not set up. These informal transactions are still being carried out. So as I said, social norms and political economy, they're not changing that quick in a lot of emerging economies, not just in China. And it seems like state capitalism, right? The role of state enterprises in a lot of emerging economies are not diminishing, right? We see actually a significant percentage of state enterprises in India, in Russia, in Brazil, in China. So all these transactions that rely on relationship and build patron-client relationship are still there. Right? I'll talk a little bit more about that. Yes.
Let me ask you a question myself. I'm curious. You painted this as mainly a positive for, in some ways, the companies, getting networks, you get access to, maybe some preferential treatment. Do you see any negative sides? So, like, for instance, if you're tied into the government, maybe they're more likely to force you to do things, or there's always in networks power relations in networks too, and maybe maybe a more powerful entity could through the network tie, sort of force the weaker one to do something. I'd love to hear more about some of the negative effects.
Here, I try to understand what's going on first, right? Why they even exist, because from the West, we always say, oh, these things are bad things, If they're all bad, they won't exist. And some of these economies will not grow as fast. So my primary goal is to understand why they exist and why at all they're even good, right? Because they can be totally bad, right? Especially in our concept, it will lead to corruption and so on. So first, understand why it's good. And then, of course, if you can only rely on your families and friends to raise capital, if you only rely on friends or families and friends to come up with new ideas for innovation, it's not good, right? But I actually want to understand why it's done in the first place, and then perhaps understand how we can solve some of the problems. So yeah, I admit, it's actually not good. It can lead to corruption, right? And also a lot of, but why it is good? The reason it's good is because sometimes politicians, when building relationship with you, they can enforce the contracts and they can also find out what's going on about you, right? So in a way, it has its benefits, but of course, it will lead to corruption, for sure. Okay, so let me push forward a little bit, but stop me anytime you want. It's more about answering questions and actually presenting this framework.
So if I may, I have a question as well. How do you combine this situation with all these new releases of code of conduct for Chinese firms? So the government has released very strict controls, code of conduct for both multinationals from outside and from China. And also this obsession that now you find in China with ESG. So all funds. So how do you combine all that?
Yeah, very good question. we've studied, for example, accounting standards very in depth, right? So let's think about accounting standards, right? So China in 2006 and 7 had a move to say, okay, let's converge to the international accounting standards. They did that because they were under criticism by WTO, right? China's dumping their, it's about anti-dumping, right? They're just lowering the cost of their products so they can outcompete in the market, other firms in the market. So hopefully, by hoping to adopt the international accounting standards, the accounting numbers are more transparent. And it did help to an extent, right? And it's a good thing. I'm supporting that. However, but after studying about more about not just China, but emerging markets adopting these sort of global standards, we see that it's not the standards that matter. A lot of times it's really the incentives of the firms that matter, right? Same standards, but different types of firms, you have different results, different accounting numbers. So that's why understanding the institution behind it is important, because the standard cannot force firms to immediately reach the global level. Now, the reason why they don't reach the global level is not because they don't want to. It's because in that environment, transparency is not optimal. Now, I need to explain that, right? So, Lourdes, I'll come back and explain why, when the government also want to raise standards to reach global level, firms don't always catch up. And firms are not stupid. They don't catch up not because they want to blatantly violate those rules. They want to they consider the environment they're in, and they make their optimal choices. So that's why, okay, I'm pushing forward to talk about a little bit of the governance features, including accounting, to then explain what's going on. Okay, so let me push forward, and then I'll stop again to answer some questions. Okay, so Chinese firms are the governance response to this environment relational contracts. So the key idea is market versus relational economy. Okay, and in relational economy is involved the firms engage in transactions with a lot of connected stakeholders. These stakeholders they know very well, and they work with them to carry out fundamental production activities. Right, so the stakeholders can be suppliers, employees, regulators, and capital providers, all engaging in long-term partnership. Not like the US or the West, that's more market-based. Suppliers, customers, employees, and so on, probably relatively more arm's length. Although we know that that's not always the case, right? I teach a case on VW, right? Volkswagen. We know that in Volkswagen, it's a family-owned firm. The province of Lower Saxony also had a significant stake in the firm. They have very their protection of the employees, right? The employees can sit on the board, and they have, other than the province of Lower Saxony, they have Qatar also being a significant capital providers, right? So even in Europe, we understand that a lot of stakeholders have permanent relations with the firm, but the contrast is, let's say US, right? A lot of firms actually have a lot of arm's length stakeholders and capital providers, whereas in China, a lot of the stakeholders have close relationship, right? So that is the difference that I'm talking about. And because of that, the corporate governance I'm talking about is how to set up a system to facilitate transactions of these relational contracts. I argue that it's actually very different from the corporate governance we talk about in the US. In the US, when we talk about corporate governance, it's really just about mainly about protecting the arm's length capital providers, these diffuse owners, right? The shareholders. It's a shareholder approach. But in China, it's really a stakeholder approach. How do you set up a system to protect all these connected parties, stakeholders? Now, the shareholders also you want to protect, but shareholders is one of the many in the group. Whereas in the US, primarily the government is focusing on the shareholders. So that part is actually quite different. Now, because of that, let me talk a little bit about the features of these corporate governance in China. One is, or emerging market, one is concentration of ownership. Why do we have concentrated ownership in emerging economy, but we don't, right? In the US, mostly is diffuse ownership. We have many, many shareholders, like IBM, Procter & Gamble, right? They have diffuse ownership. Now, Facebook and Google, we have concentration ownership, and that's another story. We can talk about that some other time. But for most firms, diffuse ownership. But for emerging market, it's always concentration of ownership, mainly government or family as the controlling owner. Why? Right? I would say that consistent with understanding why relational contract is so important, when you have concentration of ownership, the power will concentrate in the hands of one person or a family, and that would facilitate relationship building. Right? It's hard to build relationship with a CEO that would be in the firm for 5 years and you have someone else. Right? You need to build permanent relationship with someone that will stay for the firm for a long time. So that is one response. Another response is you have family ownership. Now, why family ownership, right? Family ownership is important because relationships stay in the family, right? Because relationship is a specific asset that you cannot buy and sell in the marketplace, right? If I have a lot of relationship with the government, I cannot say, okay, TJ Wong's relationship can be sold to Chris, right? Chris Marcus, I cannot sell you a relationship. It's not alienable. But if we have kinship ties, right? Or my son, Matthew Wong, can inherit my relationship with the government. So that's why family firm is important, because I can transfer my relationship with my heir to my heir, my son or daughter, right? And he or she can continue with the business with those relationships. And also, if I can signal that our firm will run multiple generations, that this relationship will last for a long time, it is actually a good collateral for me not to cheat, because I want to protect this relationship. I have these resources, that, these assets that can last for multiple generations. So I would be good to all my connected stakeholders. I would not trick them, cheat them, because my asset has a long history and will continue, right? This perpetuation of relationship is actually a good way to build collateral and not to cheat. And that's kind of going back to Chris's question earlier. Relationship can be bad. How do you make sure that relationship can be used in a good way? This is one. It's the network members will monitor one another, make sure you won't cheat by using social capital, right? If you have a lot of social capital, meaning you have a lot of relationships, you won't want to cheat another person, another member, because you'll be punished and you will lose all your social capital. And social capital is very hard to build, right? It takes generations to build. And you won't sacrifice all your relationship by just trying to rip off one member. So this is actually a way to enforce contracts. Right? Another feature in China is building relations with the government. And I think that's a lot of research, and I talked about that. And actually I have a new paper that talks about, and I'll come back to that. And then the other is accounting. Accounting actually turns out to be opaque, because if you engage in a lot of relational contracts, especially you want to build relations with the government, it's actually good to keep it a little bit more secretive, right? Because the government doesn't want people to know. Now, you say that's corruption. It's definitely could be corruption, but it also could be that when the government wants to make a private deal with a firm, and it could be an efficient, a decision for increasing efficiency, the government doesn't want to tell everyone, right? The government is its own decision. So keeping opaque may not necessarily mean that it's corruption, right? And also, it's hard to communicate relationship, right? Unless you're part of the network, you understand the social capital, right? Then you can evaluate the relationship. Otherwise, I cannot explain to someone else, I have very good relations with this politician, right? Because it's hard to verify unless you are in the relation, you are in the network as well. So because of that, these relational contracts are really hard to be communicated. And that's why it's opaque, right? So what I'm saying is that when you're in an economy with a lot of relational contracts, it's actually optimal to be opaque unless you want to change. Now, unless we talk about we're changing the entire institution with complete markets, with a different form of government, right? But that would take a long time, especially when you have social norms and political economy that are in place. Okay, I'm going to just stop here. Any questions? I'm sure you have questions. No? Okay, so I'm going to just give you a few papers that I'm working on just to get an idea with this, what am I doing, right? One thing I'm looking at is I want to understand in China how business persons' social ties work. So I want to look at how a business person's political ties will shape its business ties, right? Because as I said, right, relationship is an asset, right? How they use the asset is a human capital. So we collected all the CVs of politicians in China from the provincial level and up to the central government levels. So we have the governor and party secretary CVs. Basically, we look at the schools and the work experience, and then use school ties and work ties to build social ties, right? And these are the networks that I have developed using all the politicians over about 15 years, okay? And we use the concept of centrality to measure how closely they link to one another, right? And then this is the regression we did, the main result. So what we found is that a business person's business ties with other business persons are shaped by the business person's ties with all the politicians that I've developed in that network of ties. So if I have somehow connected with a lot of politicians in time t-1, in time t, my business relationships or my business ties will be much stronger, right? And we do business person, individual fixed effect, and so on, right? And we also, because of endogeneity, we also use the instrumental variable using the change of the factional ties, right? So I also can use the network to find out whether there are political factions that the politician is part of. The business person's linked to, and if there's a change in the ties within that faction, how it then shape this business person's business ties. Now, also another thing that we have done in this paper is that how do they build, how come a person's political tie, business ties will increase when a person's political ties increase, right? So we've done another paper, another regression that's, I think, kind of interesting. So we look at the firm, the focal firm that business person is in, right? This business person can be a CEO or a director. So if the executive and directors, if their political of that focal firm, if their political ties increase, we want to know how the firm's ties with other firms through the social network of this business person will increase, right? What I'm saying is that if this firm has a lot of business people that suddenly have a lot of political ties, right? With this firm has more ties with other firms through these social ties with business people. And we found that it has a positive effect. The reason is, if this firm has a lot of political ties, other firms will want to hire people that have ties with this firm. And this is what we found, because this positive effect we found is also related to these other firms hiring new people. And also another thing that's interesting is that the people they hire is not necessarily people with political ties. Sometimes they have no political ties, but they have ties with this firm's executives, and through them, they can connect political ties. So this, I hope to use this type of research to understand a bit more how political connections are being built in emerging economy, not necessarily just hiring a politician to work on your board or hiring politicians that already have political ties and come to your board. Sometimes you just hire people that are connected with other business people that have political ties would also help. Right? So this is the thing that one thing that we want to look at.
Hey, TJ, we have a couple quick questions.
Please.
You might be addressing these. People are putting things in both chat and the Q&A, so I might have missed some. But question about, so there's a variety of things people are asking if the ties vary. So one is, as companies expand abroad. Another is gender. Is there a difference between men and women? And I have a question. I mean, I wonder about party affiliation, how that may affect the ties as well.
Well, these are good questions.
One more thing, I'm just giving permission to those asking those questions to say the question, so we can eventually later maybe also.
Okay, sure, yeah,
Okay.
right. I'll make sure I'll end earlier so that we can have more discussion. Some of this question, I don't have the data to answer, or we need to really look into it more. We actually find private firms, these ties are actually more important in terms of building political ties.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and gender is a good question, or the Communist Party membership. I would actually imagine that if you are part of the Congress, right? Some of the business people were elected to be in the Congress, National Congress. Those are very important ties. Going overseas, that's a good question. Dual listing, right? Whether these political ties will help or hurt the firm. We haven't really studied that yet, but that's something that actually I should look at. That's a good research idea because it has tension in there. Yeah, as you can see, this is a first cut into the data because, as I said, most of the ties we talked about are hiring ex-government officials. Now we're just looking at social ties. Yeah, good question. Yeah, sorry, I cannot have a better answer. Now, couple more papers and I'm done. So one is, I'm just wondering how firms communicate, right? Because these are ties, right? As I said, ties are very hard to communicate. And if you want to raise money in arm's length capital markets, how do you do that, right? These are people that don't know you. A very important question, not just for China, but for a lot of emerging economies. How do you overcome this type of problems, right, in terms of communication? So one idea is to just disclose, right? So this dotted line is just disclose, right? But it's hard, as I said, right? Then the other idea is not to disclose, stay opaque, but then your cost of capital will go up. So we have another idea is called using embedded intermediaries. Embedded intermediaries is that you hire analysts, institutional investors, underwriters that have relationship with you, but they are regulated by the market, meaning that they want to build market reputation as well. These are intermediaries that can help you to overcome the information problem, right? Because you can communicate privately with these intermediaries and have them then communicate to the market without disclosing all the things that you don't want to be disclosed publicly, right? So we find that this is important in emerging economies. That's why in emerging economies, if you are embedded but have market reputation, you can help to fill the institutional void, meaning that, you know, the institution's not perfect, we don't have formal rules and regulations, but if you're people that are embedded but have market reputation, they may be able to bridge the gap. So we found that in China, if the firms are followed by a lot of these embedded analysts, the forecast accuracy of unconnected analysts will go up too. So the whole information environment will improve. And we've done, you know, tests to make sure there's no endogeneity and so on. So this is one idea we have. Another idea we have is auditing. To audit markets. How do you audit the books of these companies, right? Because of these relational contracts, right? People have to understand the relationship, the networks. But if you understand the network, maybe you are colluding with the firm, right? Because you're part of the network. So it's a tension, there's some tension there, right? So what we found is that in China, they actually end up hiring a lot of auditors that have strong social capital within the province. They don't necessarily hire national firms, right? That have network all over the country. They hire auditors that have strong network within the province. So we found, this is an interesting result we found. We found that network relationships have boundaries. If an auditor has network within the province, strong network within province, it will increase audit quality. But an auditor, if they have networks all over the country, but not that province, that auditor may not necessarily be able to improve quality, because knowing people outside the province may not help you to audit that firm, because as I said, a lot of relationships are quite localized. So it's not relationship per se that can help, right? Because relationship can proxy talents or abilities. More capable person will have more relationships. We're talking about a specific kind of relationship. The relationship within the locality is important for auditing. So another idea of an embedded intermediary, right? You need to have social capital within the locality to help. Now, then you say, oh, with the social capital will lead to collusion. Possible, but our argument is that you may not want to sacrifice for one client in the locality and you lose all your social capital, right? Because with a lot of social capital, you can have multiple clients within the locality. So maybe that trade-off will help you, again, to not lead to collusion. Okay, I'm gonna quickly wrap up and answer questions. So my future researchers understand more about this embedded intermediary concept or other governance approaches to resolve problems that some of you have raised, right? Because this can lead to collusion or this can lead to corruption. How do firms continue to make that trade-off, right? Still rely on relationship. The other is, would social media or these online platforms help? There's a recent paper I've done looking at investors, arm's length investors, retail investors now can ask questions to these firms. And these firms have to answer because this online platform set up by the stock exchange in Shenzhen. So we're looking at retail investors asking questions. We'll be able to solicit more transparency from the firms. So using technology, can we leapfrog, all the lack of institution in China, like you don't have enough analysts, you don't have enough institutional investors, be able to help to protect the retail investors. I'm now toying with the idea that actually these platforms can be viewed as a platform that increase collective identity of the shareholders, kind of like the GameStop, event, right? The case, right? The retail investors can use this platform because they can see each other's questions. They can help to coordinate, and that actually will create enough threat for the firm to disclose more. Right. So actually, China is very interesting, right? They're playing around with a lot of these new ideas using the online platforms to help the retail investors. All right. So I'm going to stop here. Question.
Why don't, because I've been asking, so that those who wrote the questions, maybe they can ask the question. So I would say in this order: Anne, Miru, Nan, Saori, and Tao Chen. Anne, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Lourdes, and good morning or good afternoon. I don't know longer, TG. I have two questions. I hope it's okay. The first one was about basically whether you see a change among Chinese firms as regards the relationships-based contract, especially in an environment where there are increasing calls for ESG, for instance? That's my first question. And very much related to that is whether you have analyzed or studied differences of attitudes among types of enterprises. You talk about rural and more urban environment, but perhaps size-wise, whether there are a difference or industry-wise. So that's one first question. And the other question was related to the fact, I mean, indeed, there is a key question whether the relationship-based model is affected by the fact that Chinese firms are increasingly expanded abroad. So that's one aspect of the question. And the other one is, are they exporting their models outside too? So, you know, the question is also two aspects.
Yeah. ESG. ESG is a bit tricky in China because the government is pushing very hard. So firms, I think, will engage in that. But is it really for protecting the environment, for the people, or responding to the government's push? That's hard to know. And actually, it's a good question, research question to answer. So what I'm saying is that yes, I think ESG is becoming more important, but it's probably because of the government pushing for it. So it has that political economy kind of perspective to it. Is China exporting this kind of model? I don't think so. Now, as a firm, they definitely want to push their way, right, to get as much benefit as they can. But if the market doesn't buy it, there's no way they can change the market.
Okay, Nan. Okay, so then let's move to Saori. You're allowed to talk. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Saori Katada from USA. Hi.
Hey, hi, Saori.
Hello.
So
My screen is frozen.
yeah, the quick question is on the inward foreign direct investment and China's participation in the global supply chain. And I wonder how that kind of, multilateral participation on the part of Chinese firms changes characteristics or define it certain, kind of other ways. Thank you. Enjoy your talk.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can answer directly your question because my interest is a little different. My view on that is, I think China has very good supply chain because of these relational ties within China, right? So they can withstand, they have a lot of flexibility and withstand shocks globally. So because of that, I think there is value in using China's supply chain. And so that's one, right? Another is to make the decision of whether to continue or leave, I think also has to do with the kind of ties that the foreign firms had already built with China. If the foreign firms have already built a lot of trust and ties with China, that would make it very costly to leave. Yeah.
Thank you. So Tao Chen, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Wong. My name is Tao Chen. I come from Surrey Business School, and I have two questions. Firstly, I would like to ask, with the political reform and anti-corruption in China, what is your opinion about the effect of political connections would be weak than yesterday? Because from my observation, nowadays, political relations would be on the table, not like yesterday. So my question is, it would be weak, or it's just like change in another forms in China for political connections? This is my first question. And my second question is my research interests. And because I have worked for some state-owned corporations in China. So my question is, the function of personal political relations are different to the state-owned relations. Personal political relations of TMTs would be more valuable, or it would be same? Yeah, that's what I want to ask. Thank you so much.
I don't think I get the second question, but let me answer the first question first. I agree. I think political connections or relationship are still important because the political structure has not changed, right? The social norm has not shifted that much, but the form may be different now because of these formal rules, right? Of you cannot engage in a lot of these social activities, right, with politicians, or even hire them to be your directors. These formal rules will stop some of these activities, but the informal relationship can still go on. Sorry, I missed your second question.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I can explain that in detail. My question is, because political connections would be contrasting you through different ways, such as maybe a firm could establish it through their state owner from their country. And another way, maybe the directors or CEOs, they could establish political connections through their individual ties. My question is, what's the difference between them? Which one would be more valuable for Chinese firm? Yeah.
Good idea. Good question. I think it's related to your first question, right? Maybe when the formal relationships are broken, these informal relationships using ex-colleagues and school ties would be a way to build relationships. So you will hire directors and CEOs, not necessarily have work in the government, but have just personal ties would be the way to go to build relationship.
Thank you very much. Then, because Nan Brulet is saying that her screen is freezing, but she wants to know if the inheritance goes only to men or also to women. So because you mentioned that yeah, so so women are allowed to be at the top as well in a family business or whatever other, yeah.
Yeah, these are good questions. I have not separated out, but I've done a research earlier looking at the board structure and so on. China has about 5% directors that are women. I remember it's comparable to the US or even a bit higher. However, I think the percentage of women in the political system, right, especially provincial level and up, is very low, right? So because of that, I think that political ties between business person and politicians, that part, I think there definitely is a gender gap.
Okay, there is one last question. It's 1:02 p.m. We are a little bit over time, but okay, it's so interesting. So I'm going to I cannot see the name, but it's YG. Could you please go ahead? You can ask your question.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I have two questions. Well, the first is, bank is also important to private firms in China. So is there any relational contract with banks? And the second question is, well, there is the discrimination against the private firm. So could this discrimination be reduced through relation or guanxi? Thanks.
Yeah, banking is actually relational, right? So yeah, it's not surprising that you have relationship there. And also in China, a lot of the big state banks, they have branches in the province. It's the province that will make a lot of decisions. So as I said, the relationship is very local. So you definitely have a lot of local relationship between the firms and the local branch. And yes, SOEs are discriminated against, and they would need to work harder to build that political ties. And a lot of times they will build ties with the provincial government, and then the provincial government asks the bank for their money. Yeah.
Okay, and the very last question, Daniel Johnson, you are allowed to speak. Please ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. Appreciate you taking the time for this. I was just curious. At the firm level, it seems that there would be certainly potential inefficiencies, operational inefficiencies embedded in there as a result of the network effect. So curious in terms of sort of second order analysis, is there a way to sort of quantify those inefficiencies that therefore, thereby you could assign a sort of dollar value to the relational duration, to the network itself?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're talking about. Sometimes it's a complex issue. I agree with you that everything's equal, right? When you have state control and is based on relationship, it limits you in all sorts of ways, right? Getting the right kind of capital, getting the right kind of talents. Contracts are done only within a small circle. But given the environment is as it is, right, that you have government control, you don't have the rule of laws to allow you to have arm's length capital that easily. Relationship may be the optimal way. So to do this kind of research, we do need to find conditions where it's already marketized and the firm somehow choose relationship, then they will lose out. So it's hard for us to do that because of endogeneity. So what we found is that in provinces that are more developed, they rely on fewer relationships. For example, when we look at the concentration of supply and customers that are connected, the concentration is small, and then they rely less on these embedded intermediaries. So we find things like that. I have not done enough research to find that firms deviate from that optimal. But it's easy to imagine that there are firms that will.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. Thank you very much, TJ, for a wonderful presentation. Super interesting theme. You can see that we went over time and the conversation keeps going. So really very current, very interesting, very deep research. Luo, you want to say a few words?
Oh, thank you very much, TJ. We learned tremendously, and we hope we can invite you to Ithaca one day after this crazy period.
Yes.
I always enjoy going to
Thank
Ithaca.
you. And also you have the privilege and the honor to close the research seminars on emerging markets in the spring semester. So you have done the closure. And I wanted to announce that in the fall semester, the goal is to organize a PhD workshop, a workshop with PhD students concentrating the research on emerging markets. So that will be the most important event in the fall semester for the emerging markets team at the College of Business. And in the spring semester, we'll have the research seminars again. So thank you all for attending. Very interesting and very fruitful and for all your insights in a very difficult for us subject to grasp. And you helped us tremendously to get understanding about this subject. So thank you very much. We really appreciate. So thank you all for attending. Thank you. We have quite a few thanks in the chat and everywhere, and also in the Q&A. We have another question, so but please, we are really beyond time, so you can contact Professor TJ Wong directly for that last question. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.